What's going on, everybody? It's your boy Shooky from Shook Earth Media, and today we're doing another Walking Dead video. This one's going to be a lot of fun. We're comparing the comic and the TV show today, and we're doing my top 5 changes and my top 5 worst changes. So, top 5 and bottom 5. But overall, I've really enjoyed the approach they've taken to adapting the source material. I like how they try to capture some of the best scenes and the best characters, but still remix it enough that it's entertaining for people who knew everything that was going to happen. I don't think I would have enjoyed a beat-for-beat remake quite as much as the approach that they took here, where they wrote the show with the fans of the comic in mind and keeping them on their toes and trying to surprise them as well as the original audience and satisfy everybody. And I think they did a pretty decent job at that, and I wish more movies and TV shows would take this type of approach, because they're not changing it because they think they're better or that they're trying to fix it or anything like that. They're changing it to try to keep everybody on their toes, because the root of this series is the shocking moments, some of the big drama scenes that we get and stuff like that. So I really love the approach, and like I said, I wish more adaptations would take a similar approach. But before we get into that, guys, if you want to see more Walking Dead content and other TV show and movie reviews, please subscribe down below. I hope to see you in the next video. Now let's just jump into the list. And without any further ado, let's jump into my top 5 comic changes. I kind of went in order of the series, chronological order. So my number 1 change has got to be Morgan. Now, what do I mean by that? Because Morgan does exist in the comic, and his story is similar to start with, but they go deeper in the show with that first episode where we have that amazing scene with him struggling to take out his wife as a zombie, and that being cut with Rick taking down the bicycle girl, which is in the comic, but it created such an emotionally powerful scene that really became the emotional crux for the series, and I think that scene is what hooked people. I think it's what hooked me. That's what made me realize this is more than just a zombie show. This is something different. This is something special. So I love that change. And even after that first episode, I loved Morgan being teased for seasons. And then eventually he shows up again, and we get that backstory with him. And there's a lot of great stuff there. Some of the best episodes, like season 3, when we go back to see Morgan, clear, amazing. That's not in the comic series at all. The part where the backstory with Eastman, love that episode. One of my favorite Walking Dead episodes. Not in the comic at all. Morgan does come back in the comic series, and he has a specific purpose when he comes back in the comic series. Basically, Rick, at some point, I think this is after the fall of the prison, if I'm not mistaken, but please correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, so after the prison, Rick ends up going back home. They kind of go to the police station, and they're surviving on their own, just him and Carl, right? So they go back to their house, and they find Morgan living there. And Morgan, his son, had died by this point, but he was still keeping him alive, I believe, and that was to represent a shattered version of somebody who lost their son. And that was strictly because the fact he was in Rick's house, all that was supposed to represent is what would have happened to Rick if he did not have his son there to ground him. So I love that symbolism, and I think the absence of that, it is a little bit of a shame to not have that aspect in there. But you know what? After that, Morgan just kind of milled about, didn't really do a lot, and then he got killed off kind of unceremoniously. So much better in the TV show. I've had my qualms with the Fear the Walking Dead and unclear character motivations and stuff like that. But in the main show, I'm a fan of the character. And, you know, we can talk about season 8 and stuff, but I'm talking about season 6 early. Morgan change. Awesome. Okay. Next on the list, we got Daryl. Of course, Daryl does not exist in the comics. And apparently Norman Reedus auditioned for Rick and didn't get the role, of course. They were like, he's not right for Rick, but we want to have him in the show. We want to create a character just for him. And I think that character added such a new dynamic. And the fact that he's always there in all these different storylines where he wasn't there in the original, I think it always is that X factor. That Daryl's there. That means it's going to be different. No matter what happens, it's going to be different than it was. And they didn't just take other characters from the comic series and give him their storylines. They made up all original stuff for him. Big fan of the brother dynamic that they had. And I love the arc over time, the change over time, the maturing that he went through. And I'm just a big fan of the character, the acting, and yeah, Daryl, one of the best characters. And the fact that he's so popular, especially earlier on in the series run, just goes to show how great of an addition that was. Next on the list, we got Carol. Now, this may surprise you, but Carol was in the comic series, but basically the only similarity between her and her comic counterpart is the fact that they have a daughter named Sophia. There's not really a lot that you can recognize in comic Carol in the TV show Carol. Now, that being said, a lot of people will criticize comic Carol. They say she's not a good character. I disagree. I think she was a good character. Just not one of my favorites or anything like that, but I think seeing her struggle in the prison, she was basically dating Tyrese, you could say, and then there's a love triangle storyline with Michonne and Tyrese, and she basically kind of loses her mind. And I mean, seeing her lose hope, I think is really important in the comic series to give that, people need a vision for the future. They need something to live for, and she lost what that was for her, which was her relationship with Tyrese. So I like the comic character. Carol on the TV show, it's just worlds better. And seeing her transform from a battered housewife into a ruthless killer and such a sneaky, conniving type of person, really, really satisfying to see. And I don't know that we'll get another character like Carol on TV anytime soon. I think it's almost taboo to show a battered housewife at this point, which I think is kind of a shame, because it's important to have characters like this so that people in that situation can maybe be inspired by that. I really love the Carol character on the TV show, one of the best, and she's essentially a different character, like I said. So amazing performance, obviously. So Carol, awesome. Next on the list, we got Terminus. Now, this was, I think, a brilliant storyline. They adapted a storyline that was similar from the comic series. They had a cannibal arc and all of that, but it wasn't anywhere as cool as it ended up being. The coolest part of the comic series cannibal arc was, of course, the tainted meat moment, which they did adapt. It was a different character. It was Dale in the comic series, and on the TV show, it's Bob. I think they created that character specifically for that moment. So I like the character of Bob and everything, and I think that moment is one of the standout moments of that season, and that season 5 premieres is one of the best episodes they ever did. It's so intense. I was like so stressed out the first time I watched it. I was like pacing, I couldn't sit down. So I really love that storyline, and they really took a kernel of an idea from the comic series and made it into this whole thing. They added the Terminus concept of train tracks and people following that. I think that was really smart. And the big reveal that they're all cannibals by seeing, their friends' belongings being used, and that's how it's all revealed. I think that was all great. So the Terminus storyline, I think, stands out as a really, really great change that took a simple story from the comic series and just made it way better. And that's that. So number 5 on the list, my final top 5 comic change, is Negan's redemption arc. Now, you might be a little bit confused if you're not a comic fan. Negan, he didn't die at the end of the war in a similar way to the TV show. However, he basically, at a certain point in the comic series, they let him out of the prison. He has a bit of a redemption, and then he just kind of walks off and never is seen again. And he's referenced in the final issue, but we don't really get to see what happened to him at all. So that's the thing with Negan, is that in the show, they saw how much of a popular character he was, and they gave him all that redemption. I really love the moment in the final season where where things go full circle for him, and he's basically in the same position that he put the rest of our cast in season 6. So I think that was a really powerful moment, and I look forward to seeing him in the spinoff. But I'm glad, very glad, that he didn't just walk off and disappear, because that would have been disappointing at the end of the day to see that happen. So we're going to go through some honorable mentions, some changes that I liked a lot, that didn't make the top 5. I love the sickness arc in the prison that they did with the zombies carrying a virus. I mean, this is just it's kind of a sci-fi concept, but it's just logically makes sense. It's just something that feels realistic to me. And I think that was a brilliant little storyline to add in. And it added a bunch of tension, and it gave the story direction when we're still, the governor was like out doing his own thing. We have a different storyline to deal with. So I love that storyline. I think that was a great idea. Another honorable mention I have is Shane. In the comic series, Shane's story arc only lasted 6 issues, whereas in the show, they stretched it out to 2 seasons, and it was much better, much more powerful, much more memorable. It was to the point that after watching the show, rereading the comic series, I realized how big of a difference it is, and that I kind of filled in the comic series with what happened in the TV show. So that was a big improvement and such a memorable character. Another great change was Lance in the final season. Lance Hornsby, he is in the comic series, but I think of him as a different character there because he was just doing the interviews, and he's the number 2 behind Milton, but he didn't really have many decisions that he made on his own from what I remember, so he was not a memorable character in the comic at all. Whereas in the show, he's one of the standouts of the final season. I love that performance, and they added a whole bunch of things to his storyline, where he's doing a lot of shady stuff under Milton's nose. So I really like that storyline, and I approve of that change. Next, we have possible mentions, things I would have put in honorable mentions, but things that have potential to be great, but we need to see the execution in the spinoffs before I can say that this was a really great change. I think the idea of the CRM, big, evil organization, the biggest, even bigger than the Commonwealth, and the powerful enemy, mysterious enemy, flying helicopters all over the place. There's a lot of concepts there that I think are really interesting. World Beyond explored a lot of what's going on with them and what their plans are that I thought was interesting. There's a lot of dumb stuff in World Beyond as well, but the CRM macro story is interesting, and I'm curious to see more. But like I said, I can't fully say it's a great change. The only caveat with that is that it kind of spoiled the Commonwealth a little bit, because before the Commonwealth shows up in the show, we have already learned about another big organization that's got thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people. So it did kind of undercut the Commonwealth storyline a little bit, so I got a docket for that. But other than that, I'm very curious to see where they go with that. The other thing is the variants. That's the other possible mention, because we got a great episode with the variants in the final season where they're introduced, and then we got the horde of variants, and really all that ended up being was them being able to climb over the walls at the Commonwealth, and other than that, we didn't really get any variant action other than them smashing a window with a rock, which we've seen before. So that's why it's a possible mention and not on the top 5 list, because I felt a little limited with what they could do with it. And if they don't have any other ideas of what they can do with the variants, then it feels like kind of a gimmick at the end of the day. But with that, we're going to transition into our top 5 worst or bottom 5 worst changes. So number 1, this is the most important one to me. It's the reveal that all the main characters are infected, that everybody is infected with the virus, that it's airborne, or we don't know if it's a virus or not. But the we're all infected reveal was so much better in the original comic, because basically there's a storyline where Tyrese's daughter, who doesn't exist in the show, Tyrese's daughter had a boyfriend, piece of shit, and basically the boyfriend talked her into having a suicide pact. And they were like, we'll shoot each other at the same time. She hesitates, he doesn't. She dies, he doesn't. And then at that moment, Tyrese comes in, finds his daughter dead, and he murders the boyfriend. He murders him. And then the daughter comes back to life because she wasn't shot in the head. Or maybe she was, and I forget. One of them comes back to life. I forget exactly which one. That was the moment. It's this big dramatic scene, and then that's the moment we get the huge reveal that everybody's infected. That's how we find that out. so much better than having it whispered into Rick's ear at the CDC. So I think that was one of the biggest moments of the comic series at all, like altogether. One of the most important moments, and it's the one thing that I almost recommend the comic over the show for new viewers because of that. Because if they watch the show first, they're going to have that spoiled and it won't be as cool. So the we're all infected reveal was so much better in the original source material. And the other thing that's weird about the show version is Rick holds on to that knowledge for a whole season, when holding on to that knowledge and not telling other people that would put the group at risk, because everybody should know, okay, if you die, you're going to come back, because it could be a liability. If somebody doesn't know that, and then somebody dies of something unrelated to zombie bite, and then they just assume, oh, they're dead, it's fine, that they're not even considering that they might come back, that'll come back to bite them, literally. So, Rick holding on to that just didn't feel realistic, and it was kind of a gimmick. So that's my gripes with that. So moving on to number 2, neutering the Woodsbury arc, the governor arc. This arc was brutal in the comic series. I've never read something so fast in my whole life. It was really engrossing. I devoured it. I had to know what happened. And I just didn't feel that way about season 3 of the show. Season 3 of the show had its amazing moments. The first 5 episodes are like almost flawless. But then it kind of goes down in quality after that, in my opinion. And I was a little disappointed at the time because there's so many things that happen in the comic that don't happen in the show. Like in the comic, there was a serial killer at the prison. It was one of the surprise twists. Turned out that a guy who said he was in jail for tax evasion, turns out he was a serial killer. And I think it's a shame they didn't use that arc. I think that would have been interesting, would have been great to see. And it kind of ends up wasting the concept of the prison, because in the comic they had to deal with the prisoners, and the prisoners, did kind of a rebellion at some point. There's a lot more tension there, and I think it took advantage of the fact that, these are shady prisoners at the end of the day. So, I think that was a shame, and that all the people that were already there got killed off by the 5th episode, I think. And they were originally planning to do the serial killer arc. I think the last guy to get killed, the guy who was shot outside, like kind of randomly, surprisingly, I think he was hired to be the serial killer character, and they changed it at the last minute for whatever reason. So that's a shame. And also, the governor, they wanted to soften him up to make him a bit more relatable so that they could do a bit more complexity. In the comic series, he's just a piece of shit the whole time. And you have to read the novels to get the more complex version of the governor character, which I do recommend the Rise of the Governor novel. It's very good. But so in the TV show version, there's a lot of things the governor did that he doesn't do. He chopped off Rick's hand in the comic series, and that was a big shocking moment. I understand why they logistically didn't do that. So chopping off Rick's hand in the show would have been impractical. Just having your main cast member have a green sleeve over his hand is not necessarily the most practical thing in the world, so I understand why they didn't do it. And it also just makes writing harder because there's a lot of things you want Rick to do, right? So I totally understand why they didn't do that. But there's other parts of the storyline they didn't do. Michonne was kidnapped, tortured, it was brutal, it was horrific, and then she escapes and gets her revenge, and it's even more horrific. At first you're like, whoa, yeah, go Michonne, fucking kill him with his ass, and then she's like torturing him so much that it's like, you're going too far, stop. It was like this shocking moment where the good guys, Michonne, became a villain of sorts. So really interesting part of the storyline that just wasn't at all present, and they kind of split the confrontation at the prison across 2 season finales, and it ended up making it less shocking, less interesting. So that's why I say that the Woodsbury arc, governor arc, was neutered. As much as I actually do like that they made the governor a little bit more complex and made him a bit more sympathetic in season 4, I think that was interesting. So those are my negative feelings about season 3, kind of explained. So I prefer the comic arc to the TV show in that case. Next on the list, we got Jesus never reaching his full potential. He was kind of sidelined for most of the show. They introduced him. He's this cool kung fu master, and he's also, a good guy, a moral, upstanding person, and he's one of my favorite characters in the comic series. And in the show, he was just so underutilized, barely present. They gave him like no action scenes. The only fight scene he really got was against Morgan, which is kind of a weird fight anyway. I would have much preferred to see, he should have been in so many more action scenes, and he had so many cool moments in the war. There's one moment in the war against Negan where he catches a grenade and throws it back. It's really, really cool. One of my favorite moments. And there's so many, we could have had so many awesome kung fu scenes with Jesus, but at least they gave him a good death where he got a good fight in, and it was the reveal of the Whisperers. So, I like that they gave him a good send-off, but they really did waste him while he's on the show. And the actor even came out and admitted that. I don't know how he could pretend otherwise. He's just telling the truth, So, mad respect to the actor. He did a great job. It's just, that's the thing with a show like this. There's so many cast members. Some will just fall through the cracks, and unfortunately, Jesus was one of those. So, it's a shame at the end of the day. Next on the list, we got a big one, and I think all you guys are going to agree that killing off Carl was a huge mistake. Carl was never killed off in the comic series, and he was the star of the final issue. Spoiler alert for the comic series. I'm about to spoil the ending. So the end of the comic series is Rick Grimes gets killed. He's assassinated by Milton's son, Sebastian, because he didn't like how he kind of upended how things were working. He's a spoiled brat. And it was a bit of a shame to see Rick die, but the following issue was a big time jump later. Carl's all grown up, and it was so cool to see him as the final story arc, basically. And the comic ends with him telling the story of Rick Grimes, this inspiring figure who restarted civilization, basically. And he's telling his story to his daughter. He had a daughter with Sophia, who of course died in the show. But yeah, I love that final moments of the comic series, and it's a shame we didn't get anything similar to that. My theory for why they killed off Carl is that they knew Andrew Lincoln was going to be departing the show. Stay tuned for number 5. But Andrew Lincoln was departing the show, and they thought that having Carl there would make the audience just kind of gravitate to him as the new main character. And they just didn't think that Chandler Riggs had the acting chops to fill the void left by Andrew Lincoln. And in a way, I kind of agree with that decision. I could see where they're coming from with that, but it really was a shame. And it turned off a lot of people to the show who hadn't been turned off yet. So it's a shame, and it was really gimmicky because in the comic series, Rick got to the point where he was merciful to Negan. He got to that point on his own. He didn't need his son to die and write these letters to him and Negan about peace and all of that. They made him more ruthless in the show. We'll get back to that in a second. But it was a shame. Like they didn't need to have Carl die to make Rick to make Rick moral by the end. So that was so unnecessary, and it was a big shame. And that's just how I feel about it. So number 5 is Rick's departure. Now, I don't blame Andrew Lincoln for this. He's a human being. He had young children, and he was spending 2/3 of the year on a different continent than his family. Now, if I was him, I would have tried to convince my wife to move over to Georgia. But apparently, for whatever reason, it's totally your prerogative. I look at TV shows a bit differently than most people because I've worked on TV shows. I know it's just a job at the end of the day. And people need to put their own business interests and life pursuits ahead of what the fans want. That's just the fact. And Andrew Lincoln, I totally respect his decision to leave the show. And recasting him as a non-starter, you can't do that. And I'm glad they didn't kill him off. But what makes that a shame to me is that the comic is very focused. It's Rick Grimes' story. It's his story arc is the focus, and it's very clearly defined. And then he dies, and then the final issue is about his legacy, and that's the end of the series. It's Rick Grimes' story, some other people's story too, but mostly it's Rick Grimes' story. Having Rick leave, it left a big void in the show. It kind of felt like it didn't have as much direction without him there. And a lot of people, I think, were turned off by Rick leaving. And it makes the ending of the show not feel complete at all, because we don't know what happened to Rick Grimes. There's this big question mark of what happened to Rick Grimes, and it won't feel like it's over until we see the end of Rick Grimes' story. So that's the thing with Rick Grimes. So that's why I say Rick Grimes' departure is one of the biggest, worst changes. But again, I don't blame anybody involved for how that worked out. I actually think that they did the best that they could with that situation. So I actually give them the thumbs up. Even though it's on the worst changes, I give them the thumbs up for it, because we live in the real world and sometimes things can't be perfect how you'd want them to be, you know? So honorable mentions, I alluded to this earlier, that Rick's morality was made a lot more ambiguous in the comic series, or in the TV show rather. In the TV show, he's a lot more of an anti-hero. He's more ruthless, and it's entertaining to watch. I get that. And I do like these moments where he just starts slaughtering people. I mean, it's fun to watch. However, it makes it less me. I like to think of Rick Grimes as a hero because of who he is in the comic series and that legacy that I just mentioned at the end of the comic series. I like to think of Rick Grimes as a hero. It's hard for me to do that in the show when he is waging war and killing people that should be prisoners of war. You know, when he and Morgan just kind of slaughter that whole group of people who were working with them against zombies at the time. I understand why they wrote it that way. It's a great scene. It's very dramatically compelling, but it undercuts Rick Grimes as a hero to me. So I don't particularly like that change. And the fact is that his story arc was much more clearly defined in the comic series. Yes, there was that ambiguity there, some decisions he had to make that you could be seen as morally wrong, absolutely. However, there's a lot more to justify what he's doing in the comic series than in the show. And like I said, he got to the point of, let's not kill Negan, let's keep everybody alive, let's try to rebuild civilization, work things out. He did that on his own without Carl's death in the comic series. So it's much, much better in the original version, in my opinion. So it's less clear of his character arc. But like I said, there's pros to it as well, because those scenes are entertaining to watch. So, you know, you got to take the good with the bad. Next, we got the Reaper arc. Horrible arc, filler arc, not in the comic series. Boring, generic, awful. Don't need to say anything more about it. Bonus episodes, terrible, other than the Negan one. And even the Negan one, I was a little bit disappointed by it, because the comic that it was based on was about the origin of the Saviors. It wasn't about Rick's relationship with his wife. That was just the starting point. It was about people dying over and over and over, and that's what led to the Saviors. You can read the original comic if you're interested. I think it was better in the comic series. I didn't really get what I wanted out of the Here's Negan episode, but it was a competent script. I'll give it that. So it was a good episode. The rest of the bonus episodes, absolute trash. I would have preferred not to have them at all. That's me. The Negan arc, I think we already talked about before in previous videos how they split what should have been one season story, or maybe 1.5 seasons, into 2. They had to put a bunch of filler arc stuff in there. And the stuff with Rick I already talked about that made it a little disappointing to me. But there's good parts there. I mean, Jeffrey Dean Morgan, awesome. One positive I forgot to mention in the top 5 comic changes was Father Gabriel. He was given more of a role, more acting, more of an arc. He was a bit more present in the show. They gave him a lot more to do. So I forgot to mention that earlier. Just want to throw that in here. Father Gabriel, I love him on the show, especially by the end, and how they made his story arc go full circle. Very cool. So those are my top 5 best and worst changes from the Walking Dead comic series to the TV show. Let me know if you guys agree in the comment section down below, or what your list would be, or how would you reorder it? What did I forget? What am I not mentioning? Definitely hit me up in the comment section with all of that. And with that, it's been your boy Shuggy. I hope to see you guys in the next video. We're going back to regular video content. We're doing a little bit less of the streaming coming up, so I want to make sure to have steady content up for you guys, so make sure you stay sub for that. I hope to see you in the next video. Thanks for watching, everybody. Peace out.